So think of your brain like a computer firewall, right?
Okay, yeah.
When someone makes a really direct, assertive claim to you, like if I said the sky is neon green or, I don't know, the moon's made of cheese, your cognitive firewall just immediately flags it.
Right, because it's obviously false.
Exactly. It scans the statement, sees it's fake, and just blocks it from becoming a belief.
Right.
But what happens if someone formats a lie, not as a direct claim, but as just a passing adjective tucked inside a joke?
It completely bypasses the firewall.
It does. It bypasses it entirely. It's essentially like a linguistics SQL injection. And back in July of 2026, there was this 11-second joke on a major podcast that used this exact exploit.
It really is this fascinating vulnerability in human psychology, because you become so focused on processing the humor or just following the main argument they're making that you completely miss the malicious code being written straight into your memory.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to our deep dive. So, the mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct that exact 11-second throwaway joke.
Right.
Because when we actually analyze the code of that specific soundbite, we find this wild 8-year history of a massive, real-world fraud, a super tragic clinical truth about severe autism, and honestly, an absolute masterclass in how misinformation evolves from a rumor into assumed reality.
I mean, it is arguably one of the most comprehensive case studies we have on how just a tiny grain of truth can be weaponized to basically erase an entire community's reality.
It really is. Now, really quick, before we get into the mechanics of all this, I just need to make our baseline super clear to you listening right now.
Yeah.
If you're wondering if we're taking some kind of political stance here, we are absolutely not.
No, not at all.
Our source material today involves some incredibly charged content. We're talking about statements and actions from both right-wing and left-wing figures. So conservative commentator Matt Walsh, former President Donald Trump, as well as Minnesota's Democratic Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison.
Yeah, it covers the whole spectrum.
Exactly. So our goal today is not to tell you who to vote for. We aren't endorsing any of these figures or their specific viewpoints. Our sole purpose is to impartially report on and analyze the data and the ideas that are contained in the original source material we were provided.
Exactly. We're just looking at the architecture of a narrative here. We want to understand how a very real multi-million-dollar Medicaid fraud case gets twisted into a false categorical smear.
Right. So let's start with the injection itself, which is the joke. The date is July 27, 2026. The source is The Matt Walsh Show, specifically episode 1811, and the topic they're discussing is the Shiloh Hendrix case.
Right, which was a huge story at the time.
It was massive. So for some context, back in April 2025, a woman named Shiloh Hendrix was filmed at a park in Rochester, Minnesota, and she was chasing an 8-year-old boy who had apparently taken some applesauce from her bag, and she was recorded using a racial slur against him.
Yeah.
A bystander filmed the entire altercation. It went crazy viral, and it ended in a split jury verdict. She was found guilty of disorderly conduct toward the bystander who filmed her, but not guilty on the count regarding the child.
And we really cannot gloss over a crucial detail of that incident. The 8-year-old boy who took the applesauce, the actual child at the center of this viral firestorm, is autistic.
Right. He's an autistic child. Keep that in mind, because this brings us to timestamp 3.56 of the episode. The host is pushing back against a victim impact statement that was made by the NAACP regarding that verdict.
Okay.
And in the middle of this broader argument, he makes this really quick 11-second aside. He jokes that the Somalis in Minnesota were so traumatized they couldn't even go to work at, quote, their fake autism treatment centers. But then he immediately adds a punchline, saying it's okay because, quote, they don't actually work the fake treatment centers. That's why they're fake.
I mean, it takes 11 seconds. It's basically just a garnish on a completely different argument about a court case. And yet it does an incredible amount of heavy lifting.
Right, because of that linguistic SQL injection we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Look at the specific grammatical structure he uses there. They're fake autism treatment centers. That's a noun phrase.
Exactly. It's not an asserted claim.
Right. If he had said, Somali people run fake autism treatment centers, your brain's firewall flags it. You can debate it. But by using a noun phrase, he smuggles the premise right past your critical thinking filters.
From a linguistic standpoint, it's highly effective because you can't really argue with a noun phrase in the middle of a joke without looking like you just completely missed the punchline.
Right, you just look like a buzzkill.
Yeah. The whole structure of the joke relies entirely on the audience already accepting the premise as shared, undeniable knowledge. It just assumes you already know and agree that the centers are inherently fake.
But, for an exploit like that to actually work, it has to be built on something real. Like, the best misinformation always wraps itself around this solid core of truth.
Oh, absolutely.
So we have to look at the substrate, the actual documented reality hiding beneath the joke. Because when you look at Minnesota's autism programs during this specific time, there really is a massive amount of undeniable fraud.
There absolutely is. Like, if a listener heard that joke and decided to spot check the underlying premise, they would find a very real, very ugly reality.
What exactly were they looking at?
Well, Minnesota operates this program called the Early Intensive Developmental and Behavioral Intervention Benefit, or EIDBI. And between 2017 and 2024, the spending on this specific program just absolutely exploded.
Exploded how?
It went from single-digit millions to roughly $400 million a year.
400 million. Wait, in just a few years.
Yeah, and the number of provider agencies jumped from around 150 to over 500. And honestly, perhaps the most staggering detail here, these provider agencies did not even need a state license to operate.
I'm sorry, what? Unlicensed. I'm looking at these numbers, and it just feels completely impossible for that level of explosive growth and exploitation to happen unless the state regulators were either totally absent or actively looking the other way.
Yeah.
Because an unlicensed system flush with hundreds of millions of newly allocated dollars isn't just a red flag, right? It's an open vault just waiting to be robbed.
And it was robbed very aggressively. The sources detail several high-profile prosecutions. Like, you have Abdinajib Hassan Yusuf, who siphoned over $6 million from the program.
$6 million?
Yes. And his method for staffing his autism center was to literally just hire his 18 and 19-year-old relatives who had absolutely zero training in clinical care.
You're kidding.
No. And at his plea hearing, he openly admitted to the judge that he didn't even know anyone with autism.
He didn't even know anyone with autism, but he's running a $6 million treatment center. I mean, that is just brazen.
Right, and he wasn't some isolated anomaly either. You had Arsha Farhan Hassan, who pleaded guilty to a $14 million scheme. This whole thing eventually culminated in a massive federal takedown where the Department of Justice charged 15 defendants with over $90 million in fraud.
$90 million.
Yeah, to present in perspective, it was the largest Medicaid autism fraud case the DOJ had ever prosecuted.
Wow. And as for my question about the regulators, the sources actually show the state's oversight was just a catastrophic failure. Minnesota's Department of Human Services actually admitted they had ignored early warnings.
Yep.
They closed complaints about kickbacks without even investigating them. And then later on, an independent review by Optum flagged $703 million in autism services as potential overpayments, mostly because the billing claims didn't align with the program rules.
See, this is exactly why the narrative is so sticky. The betrayal arc is perfectly constructed here. Taxpayers were robbed, a super vulnerable system was exploited, and the state protector, the DHS, completely failed at its job.
It's infuriating.
It is. Even Minnesota's Democratic Attorney General, Keith Ellison, had to partner with federal law enforcement to prosecute this. It crosses partisan lines because the property crime itself is just undeniable.
Right. So the fraud is undeniably real. The state totally failed. The prosecutions are public record. So, I mean, if I'm looking at those facts, the underlying anger feels completely justified.
Totally.
Why then does the source material score the core claim of that podcast clip as mostly false? He gives it a truth score of just 0.30 out of 1. How does that make sense?
So let's pause and actually define what an ecological fallacy is, because it is the engine driving this entire misrepresentation.
Okay, break that down for us.
An ecological fallacy is a logic trap where you take aggregate data about a really broad group, like let's say this specific state program has a high rate of fraud, and you mistakenly apply that characteristic to every single individual within that group. So you assume that because massive fraud exists in the overarching system, every single clinic run by a Somali person must inherently be fake.
I see. So the logical error in the joke isn't claiming that some centers were fraudulent. The claim being made by that noun phrase is that Somali-run centers, as an entire class, are fake.
Exactly. And when you look at the actual data, what we call the denominators, a completely different picture emerges. Let's look at those 500-plus EIDBI agencies.
Okay.
After 444 on-site visits by state regulators, only 18 were terminated for cause.
Wait. Just 18 out of over 500 agencies?
Yes, just 18. The state also ran this sweeping program called Revalidate 2026, which reviewed 5,600 high-risk providers across various state services.
Right, I saw that in the sources.
Now, They did disenroll over 3,400 of them, but overwhelmingly, that was for incomplete paperwork and administrative errors, not fraud.
So just red tape, basically.
Exactly. Out of all those thousands of reviews, only about 1%, just 59 providers, were actually flagged to the Inspector General for suspicious patterns.
Wow.
Furthermore, in early 2026, the state held 2 million claims for strict prepayment review. Now, if these centers were categorically entirely fake, like the joke implies, a prepayment review is exactly where that would become super obvious.
Right, because they'd be scrutinizing every claim before paying out.
But out of 2 million claims, only 0.06% were denied.
0.06%. I mean, that statistical reality completely dismantles their fake centers part of the noun phrase.
It does.
But, the joke had a second half and said, they don't actually work, that's why they're fake. Which really suggests this broader cultural refusal to work.
And that part relies on a completely separate piece of debunked misinformation. Because in February 2026, Donald Trump claimed in an interview that 92% of Minnesota Somalis don't work.
92%.
Yeah, and PolitiFact investigated that and rated it pants on fire. When you look at the actual 2024 census data, the Somali labor force participation rate in Minnesota is actually around 72%.
72%. I really want to highlight that. Because if you look at the overall state average for Minnesota's labor force participation, it was around 68%.
Right.
So the community being accused of not working actually has a higher employment rate than the state average.
Which just shows you the danger of flooding the zone with true scary numerators while completely hiding the denominators.
Yeah.
The numerators are the million stolen, the federal raids, the 15 defendants. Those are absolutely true. But without the denominators, like the thousands of legitimate providers or the 72% employment rate, you convert a localized property crime into an inherent ethnic characteristic.
You essentially erase the existence of the honest, hardworking members of the community.
Exactly.
And when you erase the honest community members, you also erase the most vulnerable people in this entire story.
Yeah.
Because there's a very deep, very real clinical tragedy underneath all of this.
There really is.
It begs the question, right? Why were there so many Somali children enrolled in these early intervention autism programs in the first place?
Yeah.
Like, was the demand itself somehow manufactured?
No. The demand was incredibly real, and this goes back to a landmark 2013 study that was conducted by the University of Minnesota and the CDC.
Okay.
They found that 1 in 32 Somali children in the area had autism. Now, on the surface, that prevalence rate is actually statistically similar to white children in the area. But there was one crucial, totally heartbreaking difference in the clinical profile.
Yeah, this part of the source material really stopped me in my tracks. The researchers found that every single Somali heritage child identified with autism in that study also had a severe intellectual disability, which is defined as an IQ of 70 or below.
You really have to understand the clinical weight of that finding. That is a severity profile that you simply cannot fake.
Right.
It means these children require intensive, continuous, and highly specialized support. The high demand for autism services in the Somali community wasn't inherently a sign of a fraudulent scheme. It was exactly what the epidemiology predicted. These families desperately needed help, and they were actively seeking it out.
And if you've been following the timeline of this case, the tragic irony here is just absolutely devastating. Because of the massive fraud committed by a handful of bad actors, and then the subsequent, totally panicked overcorrection by the state, legitimate clinics have had their payments entirely frozen.
Yes, awful.
The sources note that as of March 2026, there were $3 million in Medicaid claims just sitting in limbo. Legitimate clinics were facing imminent closure.
Yep.
Which means real autistic children, the ones who genuinely have severe, complex clinical needs, are actively losing their therapy.
The fallout is catastrophic. The most vulnerable people in the state, these children with severe intellectual disabilities, are basically paying the price for the crimes of the fraudsters and the administrative failures of the government.
And meanwhile, all of that complex human tragedy, the clinical data, the systemic failure, it all just gets flattened down into a lazy 11-second punchline, a joke that was literally told at the expense of an 8-year-old autistic boy who just wanted some applesauce in a park.
It is breathtaking when you step back and look at the entire scope of it.
It really is. But, Nick Shirley in The Podcasters in 2026 didn't just invent this idea in a vacuum, right? A narrative like this doesn't just appear overnight. How does a nuanced, complex situation mutate into a weaponized joke like that?
It mutates through this process of narrative evolution, and in this specific case, it spans about 8 years.
Okay, so where does it start?
The foundation was actually laid back in 2018. A local Fox station aired this highly sensationalized report alleging $100 million in child care fraud.
100 million.
Yeah, and the report included these explosive claims of suitcases full of cash being taken to the airport to fund the terror group Al-Shabaab.
I mean, those are massive allegations. But the state auditor investigated those claims, right? What did they actually find?
So 10 months later, the state auditor released their findings. They found absolutely no evidence to substantiate the $100 million figure and zero evidence of any terror connections whatsoever.
So it was just baseless.
Completely. But the damage was already done. The seed of suspicion was planted in the public consciousness. And then during the pandemic, you had the Feeding Our Future scandal.
Right, I remember that.
That was a real $250 million fraud scheme regarding food aid, and it did include many Somali American defendants, even though the mastermind of the entire operation was actually not Somali.
I see. So it's kind of like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, except this time there actually was a wolf. So the public assumed every previous shadow they ever saw was also a wolf.
That's a great way to put it.
It gave that old, entirely debunked narrative from 2018 this massive injection of retroactive credibility.
Precisely. And that brings us to the real tipping point in December 2025. A 23-year-old YouTuber named Nick Shirley released a video alleging that Somali-owned daycares were completely empty and totally fake.
Okay.
He filmed himself basically walking up to buildings, claiming no one was inside, and that video just exploded, getting over 100 million views on the platform X.
100 million views is a staggering reach.
Yeah.
But according to the sources, the, quote, anonymous whistleblower he used for that video was actually a right-wing lobbyist who had previously gone on record calling Muslims demons.
Yep.
And on top of that, state regulators had already visited those exact sites Shirley filmed and found zero evidence of fraud. They were completely legitimate businesses.
But the truth couldn't possibly catch up to 100 million views.
Of course not.
That video basically acted as the bridge. It took the narrative from some programs have fraud to a categorical absolute, like you can walk into any of their centers and nobody is there.
Which leads us directly back to July 2026 and the podcast joke we started our deep dive with. The sources actually referred to this final stage of the narrative's evolution as presupposition terminal.
Yes.
Can you explain the mechanics of that?
Absolutely. Presupposition terminal is this linguistic and cognitive concept. It describes the final stage of a narrative's lifespan.
Okay.
So over months or years, an idea is repeated so frequently that it just no longer needs to be explicitly argued. It evolves from a debated accusation to viral outrage, and finally it shrinks down into a mere grammatical modifier, an adjective.
Like they're fake centers.
Exactly. At this terminal stage, the speaker doesn't offer any evidence because they don't have to. The audience already accepts the premise as the default truth of the universe.
And packaging it as a joke is what makes it so incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
I really want to dig into the psychology of this because humor inherently lowers our scrutiny threshold.
It really does.
When you hear a joke, your brain shifts from this analytical defensive state into a purely entertainment state. The cognitive load that's required to get the punchline, to understand the setup, anticipate the twist, process the irony, it actually distracts your working memory.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Right. It ties up the resources your brain would normally use to fact-check a claim. So while your firewall is down, laughing at the punchline, that false premise slips right into your long-term memory, totally unverified.
That is exactly the mechanism. You absorb the worldview without ever realizing your defenses were breached. You don't remember the data, you just remember the feeling that the punchline made sense.
Exactly. So let's step back and look at what we've unpacked today. We started by examining just an 11-second throwaway line in a podcast clip.
Yeah.
But by analyzing the code of that joke, we uncovered a massive, very real, multi-million-dollar fraud scheme.
Yeah.
We saw a catastrophic failure of state oversight that allowed bad actors to exploit the system. But we also uncovered the statistical reality of a hardworking community with a 72% employment rate and the completely heartbreaking loss of critical care for severely autistic children who are currently paying the price for a political narrative they have nothing to do with.
It is a powerful, real-world reminder of why you always have to look for the denominators in the media you consume. Like, A terrifying numerator, like $90 million in fraud, is absolutely real and deserves to be reported. But without the denominator, it can be manipulated to paint an entire group of people with a very broad, very false brush.
You have to be incredibly wary when the actions of a few are converted into an inherent characteristic of the many, especially when that conversion is disguised as a casual joke.
Because the most dangerous lies are often the ones that don't look like arguments at all. They look like a shared laugh.
Which leaves me with one final thought for you to mull over today. Think about that cognitive firewall we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
If our critical thinking defenses drop the moment a severe accusation is disguised as a casual joke or just hidden inside a passing grammatical phrase, how many of our own deeply held shared facts were actually planted there by punchlines we didn't even realize we were laughing at?
It really makes you want to rethink every casual joke you've ever just nodded along to.
It does, because you never quite know what malicious code is hiding inside the punchline until it's already a part of your reality.